The Battle of Agincourt took place on October 25, 1415, during the long and bitter conflict known as the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France. This war was not a single, continuous battle but rather a prolonged struggle spanning over a century, marked by intermittent truces, shifting alliances, and significant territorial disputes. At its core, the war was a contest over the legitimate claim to the French throne, a claim that had been fiercely contested by English and French monarchs for generations. By the early 15th century, the conflict had already seen several major battles, including Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, where the English forces, particularly their Longbowmen, had demonstrated their superiority over the traditional French knightly cavalry. However, despite these English victories, the French continued to resist, and by the early 1400s, their position had somewhat recovered. The French still controlled vast territories, and their armies remained formidable. Against this backdrop, the English king launched a campaign to assert his claim to the French crown and expand English holdings in France. This was not just a military endeavor, it was also deeply political, influenced by the ongoing internal struggles within France. At the time, France was plagued by civil unrest, particularly the conflict between two powerful factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, who were locked in a bitter power struggle. This internal division weakened France, making it an opportune moment for the English to strike. In August 1415, the English landed in northern France, beginning their campaign with the siege of Harfleur. Though they eventually captured the town, the victory came at a heavy price. Disease and harsh conditions had taken a toll on the English army, leaving them weakened and in desperate need of reinforcements. Despite these hardships, the English forces began a long march toward the safety of the English-held city of Calais. However, the French, determined to halt their advance, gathered a massive army and moved to intercept them. This led to the fateful confrontation near the small village of Agincourt in northern France. The battle was not originally intended by the English. They were trying to retreat safely to Calais. However, the French blocked their path, forcing them into an engagement that they could not avoid. The English, exhausted, outnumbered, and weakened by illness, now faced a much larger and well-equipped French army. Yet, despite these overwhelming odds, what transpired on that muddy battlefield would become one of the most celebrated victories in military history. The events of October 25, 1415, would not only change the course of the 100 Years' War, but also leave a lasting legacy, influencing military tactics and shaping the legend of the English army for centuries to come. The Battle of Agincourt was not an isolated event, but part of a larger English military campaign in France. In the early 15th century, the English king sought to assert his claim over the French throne, a claim that dated back to the Norman conquest and was further complicated by disputes over land and succession. The English crown had long controlled territories in France, particularly in the regions of Normandy and Aquitaine, but these lands had been gradually lost due to shifting political alliances and military defeats. Seeking to reclaim these lost territories and strengthen his rule, the English king launched an invasion of France in 1415. The campaign began with the siege of Harfleur, a strategically important port city in Normandy. Harfleur was a well-defended town, and the English forces encountered fierce resistance. The siege dragged on for over a month, far longer than the English had anticipated. While they eventually captured the town, the prolonged siege came at a significant cost. The army suffered heavy losses, not just from battle but also from dysentery, a deadly disease that spread rapidly due to poor sanitation and harsh conditions. Many soldiers perished, and others were left weak and unfit for battle. With winter approaching and his army severely weakened, the English king decided against continuing a full-scale invasion of France at that moment. Instead, he opted to lead his army on a strategic march northward toward the English-controlled city of Calais. His goal was to demonstrate English strength, challenge the French to battle, and return safely to England with his remaining forces. The march itself was an act of defiance, a symbolic statement that the English could move through enemy territory unchallenged. However, this bold maneuver did not go unnoticed. The French, enraged by the fall of Harfleur and eager to crush the English force before it could retreat, began mobilizing a massive army. Word of the English march spread quickly, and French forces from across the kingdom assembled to block their path. The English, exhausted, hungry, and suffering from disease, found themselves pursued by a far larger French army determined to bring them to battle. As the English advanced, they faced increasing difficulties. Their supplies were running low, and constant harassment from local militias and enemy scouts made their journey treacherous. The French, using their superior numbers, maneuvered into position to cut off the English escape route. By the time the English reached the village of Agincourt, their fate seemed sealed. They were trapped, forced to fight on ground not of their choosing, against a force that vastly outnumbered them. Despite the overwhelming odds, the English king remained resolute. He rallied his weary troops, preparing them for the battle ahead. The English army, though diminished, still possessed a critical advantage: its longbowmen, who had proven devastating in previous conflicts. With careful positioning and disciplined tactics, they prepared to stand their ground against the might of the French nobility. What followed would become one of the most legendary battles in history, where strategy, determination, and an unexpected twist of fate would lead to a victory that defied all expectations. The French army that gathered to face the English at Agincourt was one of the largest and most formidable forces assembled during the 100 Years' War. Numbering anywhere between 20,000 to 30,000 men, it vastly outnumbered the weary and depleted English army, which had fewer than 6,000 soldiers. The French forces consisted primarily of heavily armored knights and men-at-arms, drawn from the ranks of the nobility. These warriors were the elite of medieval European warfare, trained from childhood in the arts of combat and deeply proud of their chivalric traditions. France, at this time, was one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, and its military was built on the foundation of feudal warfare, where noble lords and their vassals provided armies in service to the king. Many of the knights who fought at Agincourt were battle-hardened veterans of previous engagements, while others were eager young nobles, looking to prove their valor. The French high command believed that this battle would be a decisive moment to wipe out the English invasion force and restore national pride after previous humiliations suffered at English hands. The army was led by some of the most influential noblemen of France, including Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, and other powerful lords such as Jean I, Duke of Alençon, and the Marshal of France, Jean Bossuet. However, despite their impressive leadership, the French forces suffered from disorganization and internal rivalries. The ongoing civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians had weakened the unity of the French nobility, making it difficult to coordinate strategy effectively. Many of the commanders were more concerned with personal glory and status than with following a unified battle plan, a fatal flaw that would become apparent on the battlefield. The French army was structured in 3 main divisions or battles. The vanguard, consisting of thousands of heavily armored knights and men-at-arms, was tasked with breaking through the English defensive lines. Behind them stood a second wave, prepared to exploit any breakthroughs, and finally, a third wave consisting of reserves and reinforcements. In theory, this formation should have allowed for a crushing assault on the smaller English force. The pride of the French army lay in its cavalry, composed of mounted knights clad in plate armor, wielding lances and swords. These knights were accustomed to charging into enemy lines with overwhelming force, expecting to break through and scatter opposing troops. However, this traditional method of combat, which had served them well in past wars, would soon prove to be a liability rather than an advantage. The battlefield at Agincourt, narrow and hemmed in by thick woodland, was poorly suited for cavalry maneuvers. This would severely limit the effectiveness of their attack. Another major flaw in the French strategy was overconfidence. Many French knights believed the battle would be a simple matter of riding down the exhausted English, capturing their king, and ransoming the surviving nobles for a fortune. The numerical superiority of the French gave them an overwhelming sense of confidence, leading them to underestimate the tactical discipline of their opponents. Despite their impressive numbers and superior armor, the French faced logistical challenges. Unlike the English, who had trained longbowmen with years of battlefield experience, the French forces had a relatively small number of crossbowmen and archers, who were not given a prominent role in the battle plan. Instead, the nobility insisted on leading from the front, eager for personal glory. This decision would prove disastrous, as it placed thousands of heavily armored knights directly in the path of the English longbowmen, whose weapons could unleash a devastating hail of arrows capable of piercing armor and cutting down advancing forces before they could even reach the enemy lines. As the two armies faced each other on the morning of October 25th, 1415, the French forces were convinced of their imminent victory. With their overwhelming numbers, superior armor, and noble lineage, they believed they would crush the tired and weakened English in a swift and decisive engagement. However, what followed would become one of the greatest military upsets in history, proving that numbers alone do not determine the outcome of battle. The English army that stood against the overwhelming might of the French at Agincourt was vastly outnumbered and physically exhausted from weeks of marching and battle. Numbering only around 5,000 to 6,000 men, this force had endured incredible hardships. Having suffered significant losses due to disease, hunger, and fatigue after the siege of Harfleur, these soldiers were in no condition for a major battle. Yet, despite their physical disadvantages, they were a highly disciplined and well-trained army, equipped with one of the most devastating weapons of the medieval battlefield, the English longbow. Unlike the French, whose forces were dominated by heavily armored knights and noble cavalry, the English army was composed mostly of archers, particularly the famed longbowmen, who made up about 80% of the total force. These archers were not aristocratic warriors clad in expensive plate armor, but rather commoners, men drawn from villages and towns across England and Wales. Many of them were yeomen, free landowners who had trained with the longbow since childhood. English law required them to practice archery regularly, ensuring that by the time they entered battle, they were incredibly skilled in their craft. The longbow itself was a simple yet formidable weapon. Made from yew wood and standing around 6 feet, 1.8 meters tall, it could launch arrows at incredible speeds with an effective range of up to 250 yards, 230 meters. More importantly, these arrows, especially the bodkin-tipped ones, were capable of piercing the armor of knights and men-at-arms. This gave the English archers an enormous advantage over the heavily armored French soldiers who relied on the belief that their thick steel would make them invulnerable. The remaining 20% of the English army consisted of men-at-arms who were heavily armed foot soldiers and knights. Unlike their French counterparts, they were not mounted but fought on foot. They wore plate armor, carried swords, poleaxes, and war hammers, and were positioned in the center of the English formation, flanked by archers on either side. These men were the final line of defense, prepared to engage the enemy in brutal hand-to-hand combat if the French managed to breach the English lines. One of the most defining characteristics of the English army at Agincourt was its discipline and tactical organization. Knowing they were at a severe numerical disadvantage, the English leadership relied on strategy rather than brute force to counter the superior French numbers. The battlefield played a key role in this. The English deliberately positioned themselves in a narrow field flanked by dense woods, limiting the space in which the larger French army could maneuver. This meant that the French could not fully exploit their numbers, forcing them into a bottleneck where their forces would be packed together and unable to move freely. To counter the feared French cavalry charges, the English dug defensive stakes, sharp wooden spikes driven into the ground at an angle in front of their lines. These stakes would impale charging horses, breaking up the attack before it could reach the archers. The English had used this tactic before, with great success, at battles like Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, where longbowmen had devastated waves of advancing knights. Another critical factor was leadership. Unlike the French, who suffered from internal disputes and a lack of coordination among their nobles, the English army was under a single, unified command. The English king, despite his relatively small force, inspired his men with confidence and strategic clarity. He personally led his army, standing among his troops, sharing their hardships and boosting their morale. Unlike many French noble commanders, who often pursued individual glory, the English soldiers knew that their survival depended on absolute discipline and teamwork. Despite their exhaustion and the overwhelming odds against them, the English soldiers were hardened warriors, veterans of years of conflict. They understood that retreat was not an option. The only way to survive was to stand firm and fight. As they took their positions on that fateful morning of October 25th, 1415, the English army prepared to face an enemy more than 4 times their size, armed only with their skill, their discipline, and the lethal accuracy of their longbows. The English longbowmen were the decisive factor in the Battle of Agincourt, turning what seemed like an inevitable French victory into one of the most stunning upsets in military history. Out of the approximately 6,000 men in the English army, about 4,000 to 5,000 were longbowmen, making up the vast majority of the force. These archers were not noble knights or heavily armored warriors, but rather commoners, recruited from the towns and villages of England and Wales. Yet, despite their lower social status, they would prove to be the most effective soldiers on the battlefield. The longbow, a weapon of devastation. The English longbow was a weapon that had already proven its worth in previous battles, such as Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, where English forces had inflicted devastating defeats upon the French. Standing over 6 feet, 1.8 meters, tall, the longbow required years of practice to master. English law mandated that all able-bodied men practice archery regularly, meaning that by the time they were recruited into the army, these archers could fire arrows with incredible speed, power, and accuracy. Each longbowman could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, meaning that a force of 5,000 archers could unleash around 50,000 arrows in under a minute. This created a deadly storm of projectiles, raining down on enemy forces before they could even reach the English lines. The range of the longbow, up to 250 yards, 230 meters, allowed the English to strike at the French well before they could close in for hand-to-hand combat. One of the most critical aspects of the longbow's effectiveness was the Bakken point arrowhead, specifically designed to pierce armor. While a French knight clad in plate armor might have been able to resist a single arrow, the sheer volume of arrows fired made survival unlikely. Those knights who were unlucky enough to be struck in the joints of their armor, their visors, or weaker spots in their protection found themselves wounded or killed before they could even engage the enemy. French overconfidence and the impact of the arrows. The French nobility, blinded by overconfidence, underestimated the power of the longbowmen. They believed that their thick armor would make them nearly invincible against archers and that their heavily armed knights would simply ride down the English forces. However, they failed to account for several factors. First, the battlefield conditions at Agincourt played directly into the hands of the longbowmen. The field was narrow, bordered by dense woodland, which prevented the French from flanking the English. This forced them into a tight formation, making them an easy target for the archers. The ground was also heavily waterlogged due to recent rains, creating thick mud that slowed the French advance. As thousands of armored knights and men-at-arms struggled forward, they became easy prey for the English archers. As the French launched their attack, the English longbowmen opened fire, sending volleys of arrows into the advancing troops. The first wave of French cavalry was devastated. Horses were brought down, knights were unseated, and the carefully planned charge descended into chaos. Those who survived the initial volleys struggled forward, trampling over their own fallen comrades, only to be met with yet more arrows. The roll of stakes and the final stand. The longbowmen were not just archers. They were also positioned behind defensive stakes, which were planted into the ground at an angle to prevent a successful cavalry charge. Any French knight who managed to get past the arrows found himself facing a wall of sharpened wooden stakes that impaled horses and threw riders to the ground. As the battle progressed and the French attacks faltered, the longbowmen themselves joined the melee. Though they were lightly armored, they carried small swords, daggers, and warhammers, which they used to finish off wounded French knights who had collapsed into the mud. Some archers even looted the battlefield, stripping armor from the fallen and using whatever weapons they could find to fight. a revolution in medieval warfare. The performance of the Longbowmen at Agincourt proved to be a turning point in medieval military strategy. The idea that armored knights were invincible had been shattered. The battle demonstrated that well-trained, well-positioned archers could bring down even the most heavily armored warriors, changing the way wars were fought for generations to come. The age of chivalry, where knights dominated the battlefield through personal combat, was rapidly fading, replaced by a new era where ranged weapons and disciplined infantry tactics ruled supreme. The battlefield at Agincourt played a crucial role in determining the outcome of the battle. The geography, weather conditions, and terrain all combined to favor the smaller, weaker English army while severely hindering the larger French forces. What should have been a crushing victory for France turned into one of the most humiliating defeats in its history, in large part due to the environmental conditions that shaped the battle. The narrow battlefield and its strategic importance. The location of the battle was not chosen by the English. Rather, they found themselves trapped and forced to fight when the French army blocked their retreat toward Calais. However, the narrow battlefield turned out to be one of their greatest advantages. The battle took place on a relatively small, enclosed field, flanked on both sides by dense woodland. This meant that the French, despite their overwhelming numerical superiority, could not effectively outflank the English or use their numbers to surround them. Instead, they were forced to advance in a tight formation, funneling into a narrow front where their numbers became more of a disadvantage than an advantage. The English, recognizing this, positioned themselves strategically so that the French could only approach them in a head-on attack, negating the impact of their cavalry and making them easy targets for the Longbowmen. The French commanders failed to recognize how disastrous this terrain would be for their style of warfare, assuming that sheer numbers would carry them to victory. The heavy rain and thick mud. In the days leading up to the battle, heavy rains had soaked the ground, turning the already narrow battlefield into a muddy quagmire. This had a devastating effect on the French forces. The French knights, weighed down by their heavy plate armor, struggled to move forward as their feet sank deep into the mud. Some were so heavily armored that they could barely stand up once they fell. The horses, essential for the French cavalry charges, had extreme difficulty galloping across the waterlogged terrain, making it nearly impossible for them to charge with full force. When French soldiers collapsed or were knocked down, the thick mud trapped them, making it difficult, if not impossible, for them to stand back up. Many wounded knights and men-at-arms ended up drowning in the mud under the sheer weight of their armor. The role of the mud in the French attack. As the French knights advanced, they found themselves trapped in the soft, clinging mud, struggling to move forward. The more they fought to advance, the more exhausted they became. Their once fearsome cavalry charges turned into a slow, lumbering march, making them easy targets for the relentless English longbowmen positioned safely behind their defensive stakes. The arrows fired by the English archers rained down on the trapped French soldiers, causing chaos and confusion. Many knights were wounded before they could even reach the English lines, and those who managed to close the distance were already too fatigued to fight effectively. Even as reinforcements arrived, they too were forced to trudge through the same thick, body-strewn mud, becoming just as vulnerable as the first wave of attackers. Rather than overwhelming the English with fresh troops, the French found themselves piling up in a congested mass of bodies, making it even harder to maneuver or retreat. French disorganization and the battlefield's chaos. The combination of the narrow terrain, deep mud, and relentless English archery turned the battlefield into a nightmare for the French forces. Their lack of coordination made things even worse. As the first wave of French knights was cut down by English arrows, they fell onto the muddy ground, creating an obstacle for the troops behind them. The second and third waves of French soldiers were forced to climb over their fallen comrades, further slowing their advance and making them even more vulnerable. The French commanders, unable to effectively control their forces in such cramped and chaotic conditions, failed to adjust their strategy, leading to total disorder. The once proud French army, composed of the finest knights in Europe, found itself trapped, exhausted, and slaughtered in the mud. The battlefield that was supposed to be their victory ground had instead become their graveyard point. One of the most anticipated and feared aspects of medieval warfare was the cavalry charge, particularly when executed by heavily armored knights. The French nobility, renowned for their skill in mounted combat, relied on this tactic as a decisive force on the battlefield. At Agincourt, they believed that a full-scale cavalry charge would overwhelm the English longbowmen, break their defensive lines, and secure an easy victory. However, what followed was one of the greatest tactical disasters in military history. The cavalry's initial strategy. The French commanders planned for a two-stage attack, with the first wave consisting of mounted knights leading the charge. Their objective was to rush forward, overrun the longbowmen, and clear the field for the heavily armored infantry that would follow. This strategy had worked in previous battles, where a strong cavalry charge had smashed through enemy lines, allowing the French knights to engage in close combat, where their superior armor and melee skills gave them the advantage. The knights rode proudly onto the field, their polished armor gleaming in the dim morning light, their lances ready to impale the English defenders. The French nobility, eager for personal glory, saw this charge as a chance to prove their chivalric valor and claim ransoms from captured English knights. Many among them believed that victory was inevitable, but their confidence blinded them to the brutal reality of the battlefield ahead. The impact of the mud and narrow terrain. The rain-soaked battlefield was a death trap for the French cavalry. Days of torrential rainfall had turned the ground into a thick, clinging mud, making movement extremely difficult. As the French horses galloped forward, their hooves sank deep into the soft, waterlogged earth, slowing them down considerably. The narrow width of the battlefield, flanked by dense forests, prevented the cavalry from spreading out. Instead, they were forced into a tight, overcrowded formation, making it nearly impossible to maneuver. The knights at the front of the charge were the first to be struck by English arrows, causing them to crash into the muddy ground, while those behind them collided with the fallen bodies and horses, further worsening the congestion. The momentum that was supposed to give the cavalry its overwhelming power was completely neutralized. Instead of thundering through enemy lines, they were bogged down, struggling to move, and exposed to a relentless storm of longbow fire. The devastating English archery. Before the French cavalry could even reach the English positions, they faced a barrage of arrows from thousands of longbowmen. The English archers, stationed behind defensive stakes, fired volleys of arrows at an incredible speed, creating a deadly rain of projectiles. Each archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute, meaning that the English could release tens of thousands of arrows in just a few minutes. Many of these arrows found their targets, striking knights in the joints of their armor, their unprotected horses, or through the visors of their helmets. Even when knights survived an arrow hit, their horses were often killed or severely wounded, throwing their riders into the thick mud, where they struggled to rise. The sheer weight of their armor made it almost impossible for fallen knights to stand up in the deep mud. Some were trampled by their own advancing forces, others suffocated as they were pressed down into the wet earth, and many were finished off by the English archers and men-at-arms when they finally collapsed near the English lines. The charge collapses into chaos. As the first wave of cavalry faltered, it disrupted the entire French battle plan. The second wave of French men-at-arms, advancing on foot behind the cavalry, now found themselves blocked by their own fallen knights and horses. The narrow battlefield, now cluttered with bodies, turned into a nightmarish scene of disorder. The French knights, weighed down by their armor, struggled to move forward, only to be struck down by more arrows. The survivors of the cavalry charge, disoriented and exhausted, were left vulnerable as they attempted to retreat. The English, still holding firm behind their stakes, continued to fire volleys of arrows, further devastating the disorganized French ranks. What was meant to be a glorious cavalry charge had become a massacre, leaving the battlefield littered with bodies and wreckage. The once proud French knights, who had expected to ride to an easy victory, now found themselves trapped in a bottleneck of death, unable to escape the relentless English longbows and the merciless grip of the mud beneath them. After the disastrous failure of the French cavalry charge, the responsibility for breaking the English lines fell to the French infantry, the heavily armed men-at-arms and foot soldiers who had been waiting behind the mounted knights. They were supposed to be the main force of the French army, advancing in tight ranks to crush the outnumbered and exhausted English soldiers in brutal hand-to-hand combat. However, from the very moment they stepped forward, their attack was plagued by poor coordination, exhaustion, and the worsening battlefield conditions, which led to one of the most devastating massacres of medieval warfare. The advance begins, a struggle through the mud. With their mounted knights either dead, wounded, or retreating, the French commanders had no choice but to push their massive force of men-at-arms and infantry forward. This was no small contingent. The French outnumbered the English by at least 4-1, with a force estimated to be between 12,000 and 15,000 men. At first glance, this should have been an overwhelming wave of soldiers that simply swallowed the English army whole. But the battlefield itself had become a deadly trap. The rain-soaked ground was already turning into a thick swamp due to the earlier cavalry charge. Hundreds of dead or wounded horses and knights littered the path, making it even harder for the advancing infantry to move forward. The French knights and men-at-arms were heavily armored, wearing steel plate and chainmail that made them formidable in close combat, but extremely slow and vulnerable in bad terrain. With every step forward, the advancing troops sank into the thick mud, their heavy armor dragging them down, forcing them to move at an agonizingly slow pace. The momentum of the charge, the essential advantage of an attacking army, was completely lost. Instead of a swift and powerful advance, the French infantry stumbled forward in a disorganized mass, struggling with each step as they became bogged down in the mud. A nightmarish bottleneck. The battlefield, narrowed by dense forests, had already trapped the French army into a tight funnel, but as more troops advanced, the situation became even worse. With thousands of men pushing forward, they quickly became jammed into an overcrowded mass, unable to move freely or even raise their weapons properly. The men at the front were being pressed forward by those behind them, forcing them deeper into the mud and corpses of their fallen comrades. The English longbowmen continued to rain down arrows, striking down knights and foot soldiers in the packed French formation, creating piles of bodies that only made movement even more difficult. Some French soldiers were crushed to death under the weight of their own advancing comrades, while others, unable to stand back up after falling in the mud, were trampled underfoot as the waves of men behind them kept coming forward. The battlefield was quickly becoming a nightmarish graveyard where every inch of ground was stained with blood and filled with the bodies of fallen warriors. The English counterattack. Despite the absolute chaos unfolding in the French ranks, the English held their defensive positions, still protected by their sharpened stakes and the devastating power of their longbows. As the exhausted and disorganized French soldiers finally reached the English lines, they expected an easy fight against a depleted, starving army. However, what they encountered was a wall of disciplined, battle-hardened men, ready for close combat. The English men-at-arms, though far fewer in number, were fresh and well-positioned, standing their ground as the mud-covered French soldiers struggled to lift their weapons. The longbowmen, who had fired thousands of arrows, now dropped their bows and joined the fight, wielding daggers, swords, axes, and even makeshift clubs to finish off the trapped French knights. The French were too tightly packed to fight effectively, their armor weighed down with mud, their swords too restricted to swing properly in the tight, claustrophobic battle lines. Rather than a glorious melee where knights dueled in honorable combat, the final phase of the battle descended into a slaughter as English soldiers hacked, stabbed, and crushed their way through the helpless French ranks. Many French knights and men-at-arms, unable to retreat or fight back, were simply cut down where they stood. With no room to maneuver, no way to escape, and no chance of victory, the French infantry, who had once believed themselves superior to the outnumbered English, now faced one of the most humiliating and horrific defeats in history. As the French infantry finally reached the English lines, the battle shifted from a devastating long-range assault into an intense, bloody, and chaotic hand-to-hand melee. What was supposed to be a triumphant moment for the French knights and men-at-arms quickly turned into a desperate and gruesome fight for survival. The narrow battlefield, thick mud, and crushing congestion left the French forces at a massive disadvantage, while the English soldiers, though exhausted and outnumbered, fought with discipline, aggression, and ruthless efficiency. The French knights struggle in combat. By the time the first French soldiers reached the English positions, they were already severely weakened. The long, grueling march through the mud had drained their energy, their armor was soaked and heavy, and the English longbowmen had already inflicted countless casualties. Many French knights arrived injured, their armor pierced by arrows, while others had lost their weapons in the chaos of the advance. Despite this, the French knights and men-at-arms were still some of the most formidable warriors in Europe, trained for brutal close-quarters combat. They charged forward with swords, axes, and maces, determined to break through the English defenses and turn the tide of the battle. However, as they clashed with the English men-at-arms and longbowmen, they encountered a new nightmare. They could barely move or fight effectively in the tight, congested battlefield. The narrow space meant that the French knights couldn't swing their swords properly, making it impossible to fight as they had trained. Their heavy plate armor, once an advantage in battle, now worked against them, weighing them down in the mud and making them slow and vulnerable. The knights who had fallen during the advance were trapped beneath the advancing soldiers, unable to stand up or defend themselves as they were trampled, suffocated, or killed by English foot soldiers. The English hold their ground. Unlike the French, the English troops were prepared for close combat. Though fewer in number, they had one crucial advantage: mobility. The English men-at-arms were wearing lighter armor, allowing them to move freely and strike quickly in the chaotic melee. The longbowmen, though not as heavily armored, were aggressive and brutal, wielding daggers, swords, and even mallets to finish off wounded knights. The English soldiers had the advantage of fighting in an organized, disciplined manner, while the French forces, pressed together in a tangled mass of bodies and mud, were completely disorganized. As the battle raged on, the French knights tried desperately to push forward, but they found themselves being cut down one by one. Some, unable to swing their weapons, resorted to punching and grappling, but the English fought back with precision, stabbing at weak points in their armor and striking them down in the mud. The longbowmen joined the fight. One of the most unexpected and brutal moments of the battle came when the English longbowmen, after exhausting their arrow supply, rushed into the fight themselves. These were not elite knights but common soldiers, many of them peasants and tradesmen, yet they were fierce and ruthless in battle. Armed with daggers, short swords, and hammers, they moved among the wounded French knights, stabbing them through the ice slits of their helmets or smashing their skulls with mallets. Some dragged fallen knights into the mud, where they were trampled or suffocated under the weight of their own comrades. The longbowmen, used to hunting and butchering animals, showed no mercy, knowing that if they spared their enemies, the French might rally and counterattack. The result was a merciless slaughter. Hundreds of trapped and wounded French knights were executed where they lay, their bodies piling up in the narrow, muddy battlefield. The nightmare of the trapped French soldiers. As more French reinforcements arrived, they found themselves in a hellish situation. The battlefield had become a chaotic, corpse-filled bottleneck, where soldiers couldn't retreat, couldn't fight, and couldn't breathe. French soldiers in the back ranks kept pushing forward, unaware that the front ranks were collapsing under the English counterattack. The wounded were crushed underfoot, their screams drowned out by the sounds of clashing steel and dying men. Many drowned in the mud, unable to pull themselves free before being suffocated under the weight of their fallen comrades. The once mighty French army, which had vastly outnumbered the English, was now in complete disarray. Their knights, trapped and exhausted, were being slaughtered with ease, while their reinforcements arrived too late and too disorganized to make a difference. The battlefield at Agincourt, once envisioned as the site of a glorious French victory, had become a horrific scene of mass slaughter, with thousands of France's finest warriors buried beneath a tide of blood, steel, and mud. Key Point 10 expanded. the psychological collapse of the French army. As the battle raged on, what had once been an unstoppable wave of French knights and soldiers now began to fall apart under the weight of exhaustion, fear, and chaos. The devastating losses, the unexpected ferocity of the English counterattack, and the sheer brutality of the battlefield conditions had begun to take a toll on the morale of the French forces. What had once been a confident march toward victory had now turned into a nightmare of death and confusion, and the psychological collapse of the French army became one of the defining moments of the Battle of Agincourt. The shock of the unfolding disaster. The French entered the battle with overwhelming confidence, believing their vast numerical superiority and elite knights would easily crush the exhausted English forces. However, as they advanced deeper into battle, the reality of their predicament became horrifyingly clear. The failed cavalry charge, meant to weaken the English defenses, had instead left the battlefield littered with dead and wounded French knights, blocking the advance of their own infantry. The narrow terrain, hemmed in by thick forests, had trapped the French army in a bottleneck, preventing them from using their numbers to their advantage. The English longbowmen had devastated their ranks, and despite finally reaching the English lines, they found themselves bogged down in the mud, unable to fight effectively. For many French soldiers, the sight of thousands of their fellow knights and men-at-arms being slaughtered, trampled, or suffocated in the mud was deeply demoralizing. The once glorious battlefield had transformed into a grim and inescapable slaughterhouse. The collapse of leadership and command. One of the greatest disasters in warfare is the breakdown of leadership, and at Agincourt, the French commanders lost control of their forces at the worst possible moment. The French nobles had no coordinated plan. Many were too busy pursuing personal glory, charging ahead without waiting for proper orders. The lack of communication between the different waves of attack meant that fresh troops had no idea of the scale of the disaster unfolding ahead of them. The French commanders were caught in the chaos. Some fell in battle. Others were trapped in the mud, and many simply had no way to organize their shattered ranks. Without effective leadership, soldiers at the rear of the battlefield had no idea what was happening at the front, and instead of advancing with discipline, they hesitated, panicked, or fled altogether. Panic spreads among the French ranks. The battlefield at Agincourt had become a living nightmare. For those still struggling forward, the realization that they were walking into certain death became impossible to ignore. The English had held their lines, and the French forces were simply being cut down one after another, unable to retreat or advance. The horrific sounds of dying men, the sight of hundreds of knights drowning in the mud, and the overwhelming smell of blood and sweat broke the morale of even the most battle-hardened soldiers. The English soldiers showed no mercy, cutting down trapped and exhausted knights without hesitation. For many French foot soldiers, the only remaining option was to flee. Some turned and ran toward the forests, hoping to escape the massacre. Others dropped their weapons and surrendered, knowing that further fighting was pointless. The once proud French army, which had outnumbered the English by at least 4-1, was now collapsing into a chaotic rout. But for many French knights and soldiers, even surrender or retreat would not be enough to save them. The English, seeing their enemy faltering, continued their brutal counterattack, ensuring that Agincourt would be remembered not just as a battle, but as a complete and utter disaster for France. As the Battle of Agincourt neared its final stages, the English forces stood victorious, having repelled and decimated the overwhelming French army. However, the fighting had not yet completely ceased, and in the midst of the battlefield, littered with thousands of dead and dying men, broken weapons, and abandoned banners, one of the most controversial and brutal decisions of medieval warfare was about to take place. The English, having taken hundreds, possibly thousands, of French knights and men-at-arms as prisoners, faced an urgent dilemma. Many of these prisoners were noblemen and high-ranking officers, expected to be ransomed for vast sums of money, as was customary in medieval warfare. However, in an unexpected and ruthless act, the English king ordered the execution of these captives, an action that shocked even some of his own men and cemented Agincourt as one of the most infamous battles of the 100 Years' War. The capture of French nobles and soldiers. Following the collapse of the French assault, thousands of French soldiers, knights, and nobles, realizing they had no hope of victory, surrendered to the English forces. In medieval warfare, surrender was not uncommon, as capturing high-ranking nobles could lead to substantial ransoms that often outweighed the value of simply killing an opponent. Many of the French believed they would be treated according to the codes of chivalry, expecting to be held for ransom rather than executed. Among the prisoners were some of the most prestigious men in France, including the Duke of Orleans, the Duke of Bourbon, and the Marshal of France, Jean Lomanger-Boucicaut. The English soldiers, exhausted yet victorious, began rounding up the captives, securing them with ropes and chains as they awaited further orders. Some Englishmen even began calculating the wealth they could gain from ransoms, believing their fortunes had changed drastically with the capture of so many noble prisoners. However, this was not a typical medieval battle, and the circumstances on the battlefield quickly changed the fate of these prisoners. The unexpected French reinforcements and the fear of a renewed attack. Even as the French forces had largely collapsed, a new threat emerged. Reports began to spread that French reinforcements were arriving, possibly attempting to mount a last-ditch counterattack. A group of fresh French troops, unaware of the full extent of the defeat, was seen moving toward the battlefield, potentially posing a serious risk to the exhausted English army. The English forces had been fighting all day, and though victorious, they were still vastly outnumbered if another French force were to arrive. Many English soldiers were already occupied guarding prisoners instead of preparing to defend themselves against a possible renewed assault. At this moment, the English king made a fateful decision, one that would forever be remembered as one of the most controversial actions of Agincourt: the order to execute the prisoners. Fearing that the captured French knights and soldiers might regroup, seize weapons, or slow down the English ability to respond to a fresh attack, the English king gave a brutal and shocking command. All but the highest-ranking French prisoners were to be executed immediately. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of surrendered knights and soldiers were rounded up and slaughtered on the battlefield. The execution was swift and merciless, carried out not by knights, but by the common English archers and foot soldiers, who stabbed, hacked, and cut down the helpless prisoners. Many English knights were horrified by this order. The idea of killing unarmed prisoners, especially noblemen, went against the code of chivalry that governed warfare at the time. Several high-ranking English nobles objected to the executions, arguing that the prisoners could be ransomed for great sums of money rather than being slaughtered like common criminals. However, the English leadership was firm. The risk of allowing so many prisoners to live, with a potential French counterattack looming, was too great. A brutal and unforgiving act of war. The scene that followed was one of the most horrific moments of the battle. Defenseless French prisoners, many of them wounded and barely able to stand, were dragged into groups and systematically killed. Some were stabbed through the throat, others were beheaded with swords or axes, while many were simply clubbed to death by English foot soldiers. The sound of screams, the gurgling of dying men, and the wet splatter of blood on the already soaked ground added to the nightmarish atmosphere of Agincourt. The few high-ranking nobles who were spared, those who could be ransomed for massive fortunes, watched in stunned horror as their comrades were butchered before their eyes. Many of these survivors would later recount the massacre, speaking of the ruthlessness and fearlessness of the English army on that day. The impact and legacy of the executions. The execution of prisoners at Agincourt was one of the most controversial acts of medieval warfare. Some later historians and chroniclers defended the decision, arguing that it was a necessary military action to prevent the prisoners from overwhelming their captors. Others, however, condemned it as an act of cruelty, a violation of the chivalric code, and a dark stain on an otherwise brilliant English victory. Regardless of the justification, the event struck fear into France, proving that the English army would show no mercy in battle, and that even captivity did not guarantee survival. Though the battle itself was all but over, this brutal act ensured that Agincourt would not just be remembered as a tactical triumph, but as one of the bloodiest and most merciless encounters of the 100 Years' War. As the fighting finally came to an end, the battlefield of Agincourt was left in a state of unimaginable devastation. The once lush fields had been transformed into a bloody, corpse-strewn wasteland, filled with the broken bodies of thousands of French knights, men-at-arms, and foot soldiers. The thick, clinging mud, already churned up by the chaotic battle, was now stained red with blood, and the groans of the wounded filled the air, creating a ghastly symphony of suffering and death. The scale of destruction was almost unfathomable. The French army, which had entered the battle with overwhelming numbers, had been shattered, humiliated, and nearly annihilated. The English, despite being vastly outnumbered, had emerged victorious, and now they stood surveying the carnage, their bodies weary, but their spirits lifted by their incredible triumph. But even in victory, the sight before them was one of horror rather than celebration. The unimaginable losses of the French army. The French casualties at Agincourt were catastrophic, one of the worst military disasters in France's history. Nearly 10,000 Frenchmen were believed to have perished, with thousands more wounded or captured. The cream of French nobility had been wiped out. Among the dead were 3 dukes, 8 counts, 100 high-ranking lords, and thousands of knights and men-at-arms. Entire noble families were extinguished, their bloodlines severed forever on the fields of Agincourt. Some of the most powerful and respected warriors in France had been lost in a single afternoon. The bodies of French soldiers lay piled upon one another, some still clutching their weapons, others half buried in the mud, their once proud armor now battered and useless. Many had suffocated, trampled beneath the weight of their own comrades, their bodies twisted and contorted in unnatural positions, a silent testament to the horror of the day. The death toll was so staggering that it would take days for the French to even attempt to count and recover their dead. And for those who survived, the nightmare was not over yet. The fate of the wounded. For the wounded French soldiers who had somehow survived the brutal slaughter, a grim fate awaited them. In medieval warfare, armies rarely had the resources or medical knowledge to care for thousands of injured men. Many of the wounded were left to die on the battlefield, their cries for water and mercy ignored as their comrades fled or as the English moved on. Some desperate survivors attempted to crawl away into the nearby woods, only to succumb to infection, starvation, or the cold of night. The English, exhausted and unwilling to care for enemy wounded, dispatched many of them where they lay, delivering swift and merciless deaths to those too injured to stand. For the French noble families, the days following the battle were ones of grief and horror as they received word of the catastrophic losses. Many would travel to the battlefield to search for the bodies of their fallen sons, husbands, and fathers, hoping to recover their remains for a proper burial. But for many, there would be nothing left to recover, as the dead had either been looted, stripped, or left to rot in the elements. Looting and stripping the dead. The medieval battlefield was a place of not just honor and warfare, but also opportunism and brutality. With the French army in ruins, the English soldiers wasted no time in looting the bodies of the fallen. The most valuable pieces of armor and weapons were taken from the corpses, especially from noblemen who had worn expensive, finely crafted suits of plate armor. Many dead knights were stripped naked, their bodies left exposed to the elements as scavengers searched for anything of value. Some of the English longbowmen, who had fought fiercely and now saw an opportunity to profit from their victory, took rings, belts, purses, and even boots from the dead. The French dead were given little dignity. They were either left where they fell or hastily buried in mass graves. Only the wealthiest and most high-ranking nobles were retrieved by their families, while the rest were consigned to oblivion, their names fading into history alongside the thousands who had perished. The English army's own suffering. Though victorious, the English had not escaped unscathed. Hundreds of English soldiers had been killed, and many more were wounded or suffering from exhaustion. The march to Agincourt, the battle itself, and the following night were brutal on the survivors, who were now cold, hungry, and surrounded by death. The mud, which had swallowed so many French soldiers, now made it difficult for the English to even move across the battlefield, as they stumbled over dead bodies, broken weapons, and discarded armor. But despite their suffering, they had achieved the impossible. They had defied the odds, defeated a far superior enemy, and secured a victory that would be remembered for centuries. The emotional toll on both sides. For both the English and the French, Agincourt left an emotional and psychological scar that would last for generations. The French, humiliated and devastated, would struggle to recover from the loss, knowing that they had suffered one of the most disastrous defeats in their history. The English, though victorious, would never forget the horrors they had witnessed, the sheer brutality of the battle, and the blood-soaked fields where thousands had perished. The stories of the massacre of prisoners, the drowning of knights in the mud, and the relentless slaughter of the trapped French army would be told and retold, cementing Agincourt as one of the most infamous battles in medieval history. As the survivors of Agincourt began their long march home, the echoes of the battle still haunted the air. The smoke of the fires, the stench of death, and the distant howls of scavenging wolves were the only sounds left on the battlefield, a battlefield that would stand as a grim reminder of the true cost of war. The Battle of Agincourt was not just another confrontation in the long and bloody 100 Years' War. It was a moment of profound significance that reshaped the course of the conflict, shifting the balance of power between England and France in a way that would be felt for years to come. Though the war had been raging since 1337, with periods of relative peace and intense conflict, Agincourt marked one of the most decisive victories for the English crown, altering the strategies, morale, and political landscape of both nations. For England, it was a triumph that bolstered national pride and strengthened the monarchy, proving that a smaller, well-disciplined force could defeat a vastly superior enemy through strategy, skill, and sheer determination. For France, it was a devastating blow that left the kingdom crippled, humiliated, and politically unstable, opening the door for further English incursions into French territory. The effects of this battle would ripple through the years, shaping not only the course of the 100 Years' War, but also the fate of both nations for generations to come. The strengthening of English power in France. In the immediate aftermath of Agincourt, the English gained a renewed sense of military confidence, and their influence in France expanded significantly. The French nobility had suffered massive losses, with many of its greatest leaders dead, captured, or disgraced. The power vacuum created by the loss of so many noble families meant that France's military and political structure was weakened, leaving it vulnerable to further English advances. The defeat destroyed the perception of French invincibility, proving that even their elite, heavily armored knights could be outmaneuvered and destroyed by well-trained, disciplined soldiers using innovative tactics. The English used this advantage to press forward, consolidating their control over key territories in France. With the French army shattered, they faced little immediate resistance, allowing them to expand their presence and enforce their rule over key regions. The decline of French morale and unity. Perhaps one of the greatest consequences of Agincourt was its psychological impact on France. A nation that had once believed in its military superiority was now divided, demoralized, and politically unstable. The French people were shocked and horrified by the sheer scale of the defeat. Many questioned the competence of their leaders, wondering how such a mighty army could have been destroyed by a force so much smaller. The French nobility was divided, with many blaming each other for the catastrophe. Some argued that poor leadership was to blame, while others believed that overconfidence and arrogance had led to their downfall. Political infighting erupted between factions within France, particularly between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, who vied for control over the weakened kingdom. This internal conflict made it even harder for France to mount a strong resistance against future English attacks, allowing England to exploit the divisions and continue their conquest. The English monarchy gains prestige and strength. For England, the victory at Agincourt solidified the power and prestige of the monarchy, particularly that of the English king. The triumph was seen as divine favor, reinforcing the belief that the English monarch was chosen by God to rule both England and France. It strengthened national unity, rallying the English people behind their king and giving them a sense of pride in their military prowess. The English Parliament was now more willing to support military campaigns in France, as it had seen how effective the English army could be, even when outnumbered. The victory at Agincourt paved the way for further military campaigns, ultimately leading to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which declared that the English monarch would inherit the French throne upon the death of the French king. This was a monumental achievement, one that seemed to put England on the path to conquering all of France. The shift in military tactics and strategy. The battle also marked a turning point in medieval warfare, particularly in the way battles were fought and armies were structured. The English longbowmen had once again proven their dominance, showing that a well-trained force of archers could defeat even the most heavily armored knights. The age of the knight was beginning to decline, as the traditional idea of mounted, noble warriors dominating the battlefield was now challenged by disciplined infantry forces armed with ranged weapons. The English strategy of using defensive formations, terrain advantage, and tactical discipline became a model for future battles, shifting the emphasis from individual chivalric glory to coordinated military strategy. This new approach to warfare would influence European battles for centuries to come, making Agincourt a defining moment in the evolution of medieval military tactics. The war continues, but the path forward is changed. Despite the devastating loss for France and the overwhelming success for England, the 100 Years' War was far from over. The war would continue for several more decades, with new leaders, shifting alliances, and unforeseen events altering the course of history. France, though battered and humiliated, would eventually recover, fueled by a growing sense of nationalism and a desire for vengeance. The English, despite their dominance in the years following Agincourt, would ultimately find it difficult to hold on to their gains, as France slowly regrouped and pushed back against English occupation. The war would see new champions rise, as both sides adapted their strategies, refined their armies, and fought for control of the French crown. Agincourt, however, would always remain a defining moment in the conflict, a battle that demonstrated the power of strategy over numbers, the importance of discipline over brute force, and the fragility of even the mightiest armies when faced with unexpected challenges. The legacy of Agincourt would continue to shape the war, influencing how battles were fought, how kings ruled, and how nations viewed their place in the world. Even though the 100 Years' War was not decided that day, the events of October 25, 1415, had forever altered the path of history, leaving an impact that resonated far beyond the muddy fields of northern France. The Battle of Agincourt was not just a significant military engagement, it was a turning point that shaped the future of both England and France for generations. Its effects rippled through politics, military strategy, national identity, and even literature, influencing how both nations saw themselves and each other. While England basked in the glory of an improbable victory, believing itself to be destined for dominance over France, the French struggled through turmoil, division, and a long road to recovery. However, as history would later prove, the long-term effects of Agincourt did not entirely favor England, and over time, the battlefield that had once seemed like the foundation of English triumph would instead be remembered as one of the final high points before their eventual decline in France. The strengthening of English nationalism. Agincourt became one of the most celebrated victories in English history, fueling a sense of national pride that would endure for centuries. The battle had shown that the English army, though small and outnumbered, could overcome the might of a larger, wealthier enemy through superior tactics, discipline, and determination. This idea became deeply embedded in English identity. The longbowmen, in particular, became symbols of English resilience, representing the power of the common man over the traditional nobility-dominated armies of France. The idea that ordinary English soldiers could defeat French knights reinforced a sense of national unity and pride. The victory was seen as proof of divine favor, strengthening the belief that the English king had a rightful claim to the French throne. Many in England believed it was their destiny to rule over France, and Agincourt was often cited as evidence of this belief. The battle became a legendary tale, inspiring poetry, songs, and historical writings that celebrated the heroism of the English army and portrayed the French as arrogant and weak. For years after the battle, Agincourt was remembered in England as an example of how courage, discipline, and faith could overcome even the most impossible odds. This belief would shape England's military mindset for centuries to come. The political fallout in France, division and weakness. For France, Agincourt was a devastating humiliation, not only in military terms but also politically. The loss of so many nobles in a single day created a power vacuum, leading to increased political instability and internal divisions. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, which had already weakened France before Agincourt, became even more destructive. The defeat at Agincourt made the Burgundians more willing to ally with the English, further splitting the country. King Charles VI of France, who was already suffering from bouts of madness, was unable to provide strong leadership in the wake of the disaster. His inability to unite the French nobility meant that France remained politically fractured and vulnerable. The lack of leadership and military strength after Agincourt allowed the English to push deeper into French territory, eventually leading to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, in which England was declared the rightful heir to the French throne. Had the French been able to recover more quickly from Agincourt, they might have prevented English expansion in France. Instead, the battle left them too weak and divided to stop further English advances. The temporary expansion of English power in France. In the immediate years following Agincourt, England's dominance in France seemed inevitable. The victory had shattered the French army and given England a sense of unstoppable momentum. By 1420, the Treaty of Troyes officially recognized the English king as the heir to the French throne, meaning that England was on the verge of controlling all of France. English forces, emboldened by their victory, continued their campaigns, capturing key cities and strengthening their grip on northern France. The war seemed to be going entirely in England's favor, and for a time, it appeared as though they would achieve what no English king had done before: complete domination of France. But despite this golden moment for England, their success would prove to be short-lived. The turning of the tide, France's resurgence. Though Agincourt temporarily crippled France, it also became a catalyst for change. Over time, the French learned from their mistakes, adapted their military strategies, and found new leadership that would ultimately drive the English out of France. In the years following Agincourt, France began to move away from relying solely on heavy cavalry and started to develop more flexible military tactics that could counter English longbowmen. The rise of Joan of Arc in the 1420s gave France the symbolic and military leadership it desperately needed, rallying the French forces and turning the tide of the war. By the mid-15th century, the English had lost nearly all of their territory in France, and by 1453, the 100 Years' War ended with England driven completely out of France, except for Calais. The lessons France learned from Agincourt ultimately helped them win the war, proving that while a single battle can be a defining moment, it does not always determine the final outcome of a war. The decline of English power and the loss of France. Though Agincourt had been a glorious victory for England, it did not result in lasting dominance over France. In fact, in the long term, the war's final outcome left England weaker, not stronger. The enormous cost of maintaining a war in France drained England's economy, leading to financial struggles and discontent among the nobility. As England lost its French territories, political unrest grew at home, eventually contributing to the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war that tore England apart for decades. The dream of an English-controlled France ultimately collapsed, and instead of ruling over a vast empire, England found itself isolated and embroiled in its own internal conflicts. The irony of Agincourt is that, despite its legendary status in English history, it was one of the last great English victories in France. Though it brought temporary glory, it did not secure England's long-term power over its continental holdings. The cultural legacy of Agincourt. Even after the 100 Years' War ended, Agincourt continued to live on in legend, literature, and national memory. The battle was immortalized by William Shakespeare in his play, Henry V, in which the English king gives a stirring speech before the battle, inspiring his outnumbered troops to victory. The phrase, "We few, we happy few," "We Band of Brothers" became one of the most famous passages in English literature, capturing the spirit of camaraderie and defiance that defined Agincourt. In England, the battle remained a symbol of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds, reinforcing national myths of English resilience and ingenuity. In France, Agincourt was remembered as a shameful and tragic defeat, but also as a turning point that eventually led to France's national revival and ultimate victory over England. Even today, the Battle of Agincourt is studied as one of the most significant battles in medieval history, not only for its tactical brilliance, but for its long-term consequences that shaped the futures of both England and France. It remains a testament to the unpredictable nature of warfare, where one side can achieve a spectacular victory, only to later lose everything it fought for.